Well, thanks everyone for coming, especially so early in the morning. Maybe since some of the grad students are here, maybe I'll start with a little cautionary tale. The advice of it being to not be like me in the following respects. I've been trying to write this paper probably for 14 or 15 years, and I'm not sure it's there yet, but that's for you to judge, I guess, today. That's right. A long ago ancestor of this paper was actually a chapter from my doctoral dissertation, and I remember vividly during my defense that this was the one. It was this very technical chapter, lots of symbols and stuff about possible worlds and all that stuff, and it was the one chapter that nobody said anything about in my oral defense of my thesis. And being even younger and more foolish at the time than I am now, I thought this was a really good sign about the caliber of the chapter. Now I think there might be another hypothesis that explains the data. So let's just start right in. So let's say there's a bunch of definitions of this term in the literature, but let's use this one. This is the one currently favored by William Hasker, the very eminent philosopher of religion who I'm going to be criticizing today. So he says in a recent publication that a token or a type of evil is gratuitous if and only if God, if he exists, knows beforehand that it's likely or certain that he could prevent it in a way such that the world would overall be better. That's the idea. Now, this kind of evil features prominently in certain arguments for atheism, right? So I say here, the evidential argument. This is an argument for atheism. Really, it's a family of arguments for atheism. And the argument is very straightforward. It's a very simple argument pattern that should be familiar to all of us, and it goes like this. Premise 1, if God exists, then no gratuitous evil occurs. Premise 2, probably gratuitous evil occurs, or you can skip out the probably if you're really confident gratuitous evil occurs. So by modus tollens, probably God does not exist, or God does not exist. Now, most of the action about this argument, and there's an enormous amount of literature about this kind of argument, most of it concerns premise 2. There's an enormous and very intricate literature on a view that's called skeptical theism. And that view tries to block premise 2. It tries to say, look, there's something about our epistemic situation or circumstances or our way of seeing the world that means we should be not very confident in judging that probably gratuitous evil occurs. The rough idea is something like this. Look, God, if there is a God, it would be omniscient and know an awful lot of things about goods and evils and the connections between them. And why would we suppose that we, far more limited creatures, would have the ability to discern God's reasons, if such there were, for permitting these evils? That's the basic thought here. That view, of course, is, as I said, is enormously controversial. There's a huge literature back and forth on it. But that's the main way in which people have tried to criticize this argument. I'm not going to talk at all about that today, except a little bit at the end. I'm going to talk about premise 1 today. And you might think that this seems like a very obvious claim. It's been called things like this in the literature. So one author calls it the establishment position. Another author calls it the standard claim. Another author says that it's a conceptual truth deserving of assent by theists and non-theists alike. Another author says that it's a necessary truth and that to deny it would be radical, if not revolutionary. So it's pretty widely assumed in the literature. But of course, philosophers always try to find an unconventional tack on things. So there are a few philosophers, a few really prominent philosophers, who try in one way or another to resist premise 1. So today I'm going to be talking about William Hasker, recently retired from Huntington, now it's called Huntington University, and his attempt to resist premise 1. I think, to give you the conclusion, I think it fails, but it's a very intriguing argument. So just a quick word on his motivation here. This will be important again at the end. I think he wants to resist 1, in part at least, because he's no fan of skeptical theism. He thinks that to deny that it's likely or certain that there's gratuitous evil in the world is just crazy. He doesn't think he's a theist, but he thinks it's totally implausible to go to that route. But he wants to defend his theism against this particular argument for atheism, so he's trying to seek another strategy here. That's I think, part of his motivation anyway. He's not arguing that premise 1 is false. Rather, he wants to argue that it can be reasonably resisted. By whom? Well, by theists. He thinks that premise 1 is less well established than other premises or propositions in the theist's worldview. He doesn't say this, but I think he could also say that premise 1 should be reasonably resisted by someone who finds his argument compelling, even if that person is not himself or herself a theist. You might think that if theism is true, then these certain propositions, which I'll get to, are likely, in which case it could be reasonable to resist premise 1. So that's the idea. It's a more modest criticism here. And one last preliminary point here. The context of this argument, of course, the context of this argument is the debate about whether or not theism is true. But there's an orthogonal debate that I'm interested in right now, and that I think to which I think one is relevant here. And that's the debate about whether or not it would be a good thing for there to be a God. So not about whether there is such a being, but whether or not one should want there to be such a being, or whether one should hope or wish there to be such a being, or whether there are good arguments for thinking that things would be better or worse or neutral if there were such a being. So protheism here is the view that things, hard to cash it out exactly, but the idea roughly is that things would be better if there were a God. It's a view that an atheist might hold as well as a theist, or an agnostic, of course. And you might think that this premise, if true, would provide considerable support for the view protheism, right? If there were a God, then there wouldn't be any pointless or gratuitous evil. That would be surely at least one important respect in which things would be better if there were a God. So you might think that a defense of premise 1 would help with that view, and that a criticism of premise 1 would sort of somehow defeat that view or undermine it in some way. Interestingly, as we'll see, Hasker's view is a little bit different. He doesn't discuss this other debate about whether or not it would be a good thing for God to exist. But I think he thinks that if God were in the business of preventing all gratuitous evils, that would make things worse. So maybe we can talk a little bit about how this context would pertain to the other context later on. Okay. So here's the argument, and I've struggled for an awfully long time to figure out how to present the argument. Hasker presents it in a number of papers, sort of lays it out and responds to a number of critics, so it appears in various places. And I'm not certain that this is perhaps the best way to express the argument, but I hope it'll be reasonably clear, and I hope it's charitable to his intent. It starts with this claim, that if God were to prevent all gratuitous evil, this is something that we would know about. He doesn't say reasonably believed. I've added that to make the argument a little bit more modest. Well, why does he think that? He gives two reasons. First of all, he thinks that if theism is true, then God would be very interested in seeing to it that we come to know God's nature, and an important part of God's nature under this assumption is this claim that God would be in the business of preventing gratuitous evil. So it has to do with God's desire for us to come to know him. And secondly, of course, Hasker, as lots of other philosophers have said, God wouldn't be a deceiver. Right? So those two considerations together, he thinks, are sufficient to give some plausibility to premise A here. So if God really exists and is in the business of preventing all gratuitous evil, we would come to know about it. We would at least, I add, reasonably believe that this is the case. And then comes a thought experiment. Now, to walk you through the thought experiment, I first need to introduce a distinction. It'll be familiar to some of you, perhaps, between so-called moral evil, sounds like a paradox, but it's not, moral evil and natural evil. So very roughly, moral evil is the kind of evil that is perpetrated by moral beings, right? Whereas natural evil, which I'll get to in premise C, is the sort of pain and suffering or evil, let's call it, that is not caused in any way by moral agents, right? So the pain and suffering, the evil that comes from famines and earthquakes and natural disasters and that sort of thing. Okay, so premise B here is going to be about moral evil, and premise C is going to be about natural evil. And he thinks that if we know or reasonably believe that God prevents either of those things, there are going to be bad consequences. So here's the thought experiment. The thought experiment is this. Imagine that this was really true. Imagine that you were to be very confident that God is in the business of preventing all gratuitous evil. And remember, God's omnipotent, right? The thought, roughly, is this. Suppose that you're a bystander as some act of evil, moral evil, is about to be perpetrated. Someone's about to be kidnapped or something, right? And then you think to yourself, well, now, should I intervene here? Should I do something about this horrible thing that's about to happen? And then you might think to yourself, well, wait a minute, now hold on. If it occurs, then I know that it's non-gratuitous, because there's this cosmic guarantee in the universe that no evil is going to be gratuitous, right? So if this instance of evil actually occurs, I know for sure, or at least I reasonably believe, that it's going to be, maybe with a very high confidence, I'm very reasonable in believing that it's going to be a non-gratuitous instance of evil. And a non-gratuitous instance of evil, in some way, shape, or form, is an evil that has a point, right? Maybe even an evil that makes the world better overall. So Hasker thinks that if you really take this idea seriously, that your motivation to prevent moral evil is going to be undermined. Now let's change the example just a little bit. Let's suppose that the evil you're thinking about preventing is one that you yourself are contemplating perpetrating, right? So then you might reason similarly that, look, if this evil occurs, if I'm actually able to pull this bad thing off, you know, cheating on a test or whatever it is, it's going to be non-gratuitous, right? There's a cosmic guarantee that if I successfully cheat on this test, it's going to be non-gratuitous. The author of all things, who's omnipotent and so forth, is going to see to that. So do I still have the same motivational structure for morality? Hasker doesn't think so. Just a quick word on undermining. He doesn't exactly say what he means here, but someone suggested to me recently that you might talk about this in two different ways. One is a kind of psychological undermining, that your that there's just this fact about us, the psychological fact that our motivation to behave morally would be undermined. Hasker might mean that. I think he does. I think he also means something else, that it would somehow be philosophically undermined as well, that whether you're a consequentialist or a virtue theorist or a deontologist, somehow moral prohibitions and injunctions and so forth wouldn't make as much sense as they would if this weren't the case. So I think he means both of those things. Okay, so that's his big thought experiment. And he runs a variant of it with respect to natural evil. I'll just try to explain this fairly simply. One thing he thinks that happens when natural evil occurs is that we develop certain goods by responding to it. We develop the goods of courage and foresight and cooperation when we try to mitigate or minimize or prevent the effects of natural disasters, right? So now I'm talking about natural evil. Here it was moral evil. Well, again, it's the same idea, right? If you're thinking about helping someone who's been the victim of some horrible natural disaster, but you also think that no evil that occurs can possibly be gratuitous, right? Because there's this cosmic guarantee that no evil is gratuitous. Hasker thinks your motivation to develop those goods or maybe to acquire them in response to natural evil is going to be undermined. And again, maybe the undermining is sort of a psychological undermining. I think he means that, but I think he also means that somehow moral systems that enjoin you to behave morally with respect to natural evil will somehow lose their philosophical force. Okay, well, the rest of the argument's pretty straightforward. If you accept these premises, the rest is going to go pretty well. So D, if God prevents gratuitous evil, then these motivations are undermined. This is a claim that Hasker thinks theists are largely going to endorse, the idea that God's plan for creation, that it's an important part of this plan, that ensuring that these motivations are not, in fact, undermined. That matters to God, according to Hasker. Or more carefully, Hasker thinks that theists should think that this matters to God, and even non-theists who think that if there were a God, then the God would be sort of a person who would care about these things, right? Well, so if you accept the argument so far, you might be inclined towards premise F as well. Look, God is not obliged to thwart his own plan for creation in either respect or both of these respects. That wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. So if you accept that, then you get to the conclusion that God is actually under no obligation, very surprising and counterintuitive conclusion, especially coming from a theist, that God is under no obligation whatsoever to prevent all gratuitous evil, whether it's moral or natural. So that's the argument, and there's been this mini literature on it over the past couple of decades. As I said, this is a minority view within the larger analytic field of religion literature on the problem of evil. I think his thought experiment's really intriguing. I'll be honest, I'm still not sure exactly what I think about it, but let me offer a few thoughts anyway. First, I want to clarify something. You might be listening to this thinking, now wait a minute. Is the argument here that God somehow needs gratuitous evil to really occur in order to bring about his plan for creation or in order to prevent moral motivation from being undermined? Because if you thought that, then you might think, well, listen, wait a minute. You know, this God is not a terribly good God. God needs a better plan than that, right? If his plan involves somehow that gratuitous moral evil actually occur. Well, if you think that, then Hasker, I think, can resist that claim, right? I don't think he needs to say that the occurrence of this moral evil is required. Rather, the issue here is its permission, right? So suppose if you grant premise A and premise B, the idea is this: God's preventing gratuitous moral evil suffices to undermine moral motivation, right? Well, the contradictory of prevent is permit, so the conclusion is that God should permit gratuitous moral evil to occur. But God's permitting it doesn't entail that it occurs, right? So God might permit gratuitous moral evil to occur in the following sense. He might set up the world such that there are these creatures and they have this kind of freedom or that kind of freedom, perhaps libertarian free creatures. And so God permits gratuitous moral evil in the following sense. And this sort of thought is pretty familiar among philosophically inclined theists. The idea is that God gives them the power to commit these acts of gratuitous moral evil if they want to, right? Okay, but they don't have to do it, right? But now that might sound, you might think there's a further paradox here, something very puzzling here, right? Because you might think, well, what if it goes like this? What if God permits gratuitous moral evil in this sense, but we, creatures, get our act together and prevent all of it ourselves, right? Then you might think, well, wait a minute, wasn't Hasker saying that the prevention of all gratuitous moral evil would lead to morality being undermined? In which case, if you thought that, then there'd be something really puzzling here. You might think that Hasker's committed to this very paradoxical position, namely that if we all act morally in at least this respect by preventing all gratuitous moral evil, then moral motivation would be undermined. That would be a crazy result, right? I don't think he has to be caught there. I don't think that's a decisive criticism of Hasker, or rather, I think that would be a kind of misunderstanding. The idea, recall, is this. If God prevents all gratuitous moral evil, we would find out, right? He's committed. That's premise A. We'll talk about whether it's plausible in a few minutes, but that's premise A. We'd find out, right? We'd know or reasonably believe it. And it's our finding this out that undermines moral motivation, right? According to premise B. But if we get our act together and prevent all gratuitous moral evil, there's no ironclad guarantee that we would find this out or that we'd reasonably believe it, right? Maybe we all act morally such that there's no gratuitous moral evil, but we don't form the belief that's reasonable or certain or amounts to knowledge that we have in fact prevented all gratuitous moral evil. It's not guaranteed, right? There might be lots of facts about our moral behavior that none of us comes to know or that we don't come to know or reasonably believe collectively. So it's the presence or the absence of belief, it's the presence, rather, of the belief that undermines moral motivation. That belief is certainly going to be there, given premise A. If God prevents the gratuitous moral evil, it's not guaranteed to be there if we prevent gratuitous moral evil. So I think Hasker can avoid the charge that he's in some sort of paradoxical position here. Okay, well now you're thinking, fine, maybe there's a gap between the permission of gratuitous moral evil, or moral evil generally, and its occurrence. There can't be a gap like that with natural evil, you might think, right? If God permits natural evil, then that natural evil occurs. In which case, you might say, well, a God like that needs a better plan, right? A better plan than allowing natural gratuitous evil. So, again, granting A and this time premise C, God's preventing gratuitous natural evil suffices for this moral motivation to be undermined, this business about acquiring these goods like cooperation and foresight. So again, parity of reasoning, God should permit gratuitous natural evil to occur. And as I was just saying, it might seem to you that in this case, permitting gratuitous natural evil does suggest or entail maybe even that it occurs. So Hasker, I think, would want a way to resist this inference. I think he could do it in a couple of ways. He could say, he could take a line that many deem to be implausible, but famously Alvin Plantinga speculated in the 70s that maybe there's no such thing as gratuitous natural evil at all. Maybe what we think of as earthquakes and forest fires and tornadoes and things are actually the morally bad actions of supernatural agents, demons and the like, right? This is a thought that's not unique to Plantinga, but he's a prominent analytic philosopher who speculated that. If so, then that would be a sense in which God could permit it to occur without it following that it occurs, right? God permits gratuitous natural evil in the sense that he sets up the universe such that there are these supernatural agents who have this kind of freedom to perform it or not, and whether they perform it is up to them. That's one way. Another way, maybe a more plausible way, for Hasker to avoid this consequence here is to say, look, following Peter van Inwagen, he might say, look, God permits gratuitous natural evil in the following sense. He sets up the universe to include these chancy or indeterministic processes, which may or may not issue in forest fires and hurricanes and tornadoes and the like. So God permits it in that sense. Of course, it doesn't entail that it occurs, because after all, there's chance or indeterminacy here. So I say that these last two slides are really about clarifying the argument. I think the bottom line here is that there may be reasons internal to theism, or there may be theological motivations for someone like Hasker to say, look, God's plan for creation doesn't involve the actual occurrence of gratuitous evil, it merely involves its possibility. Okay? I think Hasker can sign off on that. So maybe that avoids a certain set of objections. Let me turn to a few other possible objections to Hasker's view. Oh, I should make that last point here. Hasker really does think, as I mentioned earlier, where'd it go? Hasker really does think that both sorts of gratuitous evil really do occur, right? He's no skeptical theist. Well, maybe you're thinking, hold on a minute, there's something really funny about this argument. Maybe it's somehow self-defeating, right? I mean, at the end of the day, isn't Hasker saying God needs to allow gratuitous evil in order that morality not be undermined? In which case you might say, well, that doesn't sound gratuitous anymore. That sounds very much like the sort of evil that's permitted for the sake of a greater good, an evil that has a point, right? So it might look like it's self-defeating. Hasker, I think, has a good response that he can make and indeed has made, and even some of his critics have made this or accepted it. The idea here is this. On Hasker's picture, God needs there to be a class of gratuitous evils, okay? A class of permitted gratuitous evils, if we remember the moral of the last two slides. Now, this instance or that instance or each individual instance of this class is genuinely gratuitous, but the existence of the class itself is not gratuitous. Why does the class of gratuitous evils exist? Well, in order that morality not be undermined. The existence of the class is non-gratuitous. Each of its members, however, is gratuitous. Right? Hasker offers this applause analogy, right? If you have a room full of people clapping, as I fervently hope you will shortly, you can prevent any one individual member of the audience from clapping without destroying the phenomenon of applause, but of course you can't take away all the instances of clapping without destroying the phenomenon of applause, right? So you distinguish between the class and its members. I think that's a good reply. I think Hasker's argument is not self-defeating in this way. Well, of course, you might reject premise E. Let's just start there, right? Someone might say, look, this story about God's plan for creation and God being keen on moral motivation and so forth, I don't buy it, right? I don't even sort of hypothetically buy it that if theism were true, then this is the sort of thing God would care about. Sure, you could run that argument. I'm not terribly tempted by it myself. I think it's a little bit churlish to say that, right? In any case, I think one only needs to be reasonable in believing that if theism were true, then it's plausible to think that God would care very much that moral motivation not be undermined, right? And that doesn't sound crazy to me. You can tell me if you disagree. So, that's an avenue, though, right? Someone could try to criticize premise E. Well, what about this? Someone might say, look, let's start right at the top. Let's start with premise A. Premise A says, look, if God does this, then we would find out about it, right? We would know or reasonably believe that God prevents all gratuitous evil. Maybe that's the one to resist. Who knows, right? Lots of people say, lots of theists say that God's nature is very mysterious. Lots of theists have said that throughout history and still today. We don't understand God's nature in and of itself, nor still all the things that might follow from that, right? It's this enormously complicated thing. So you might have a kind of general skepticism there. Well, maybe, right? Hasker doesn't quite put it this way, but I think this would be the right reply. Maybe that's true. Maybe theists should be skeptical about whether they know everything that follows from God's nature or what God's nature is exactly like. Maybe non-theists should be skeptical that if theism were true, that God would be like this or like that. But look, Hasker's trying to criticize premise 1 of an argument for atheism. If you want to defend that argument by saying that premise 1 can't be known or reasonably believed, you've committed what I call here dialectical suicide, right? So maybe you can have some general skepticism, but if you want to be skeptical about premise 1, you're hardly giving a stirring defense of the argument that you're trying to defend, right? So I think dialectically that's a good response here. Well, okay, you might think to yourself, okay, this general move won't work, but maybe here's a more specific claim. Maybe we should focus on this. Maybe God would block us from believing this very thing, right? Remember Hasker said God's not going to be a deceiver and God wants us to know his nature. Some people have said, well, look, here's the trade-off. Sure, it might be nice for God to have a policy where we come to know his nature, but there would be all these consequences here, right? If God can't prevent all gratuitous evil, surely God would rather be a little bit more mysterious and see to it that there's no gratuitous evil, right? So that's a specific way of making this general criticism here. So Of course, Hasker's going to say in reply to that, God can't deceive, right? He might sort of toe the line there. Or he could say, look, is it really clear that things would be better if God's deceiving us versus if God's preventing all gratuitous evil? He could try to contest this comparative judgment one way or another. But really, the bottom line is this. For this to be a good criticism of Hasker's view, it's got to ultimately turn into a criticism, a claim that premise one can't be known or reasonably believed. And again, that's going to be dialectical suicide in the context here. So I don't think that these criticisms of Hasker's argument are very telling. Maybe there's a few other ways to try this. Well, what if we grant premise A, which says if God prevents gratuitous evil, then we would find out? And what if we reject then either premise B or premise C? Remember, premise B says that our moral motivation would be undermined, and premise C says more or less the same thing with respect to gratuitous natural evil. What if we try to reject that? What if, in particular, we appeal to the existence of actual theists, right? There are lots of theists who really believe that God exists, who really believe that God prevents all gratuitous evil, but who don't feel that moral motivation has been undermined, either psychologically or philosophically, right? If there really are people like that, and it seems like there are, then that seems like it would count against premise B. I think this is a more promising criticism of Hasker's strategy. What Hasker actually says in reply, I think, amounts to basically dismissing. These are basically counterexamples, right? Someone says, look, if you believe that God exists and that God prevents gratuitous evil, then you should have your moral motivation undermined. Someone presents a counterexample. Here walks a theist who believes all these things but doesn't think that moral motivation is undermined. Indeed, thinks that she has moral duties to God to behave morally and so forth, right? Hasker basically says people like that are confused. They have some kind of cognitive dissonance. They're not seeing the implications of their view or something like that. I don't know exactly what to think of that reply, but it does feel to me as though he's basically trying to dismiss these counterexamples, right? Or put the blame on them for not having their moral motivation undermined. I'm not sure that's decisive. Right? All right, well, the previous criticisms have been tried in the literature. Here's something new that hasn't appeared in the literature. What if you say this against B and C? So we're granting A, but you want to criticize B and C. You say, look, God would let us know, we're granting A, God would let us know that let us find out perhaps that he's preventing all this gratuitous evil. But, and indeed, if we drew the right conclusions, we would find that our moral motivation is undermined. But here's where God's going to intervene. God's going to block us from basically following Hasker's argument to its conclusion. God's going to ensure that moral motivation is undermined. God's going to assure, that moral motivation is not undermined by preventing us from seeing how these pieces fit together, by preventing us from seeing that it should be undermined, right? Maybe God could do that, right? Maybe sounds a little bit silly or frivolous, but I think there's actually some upsides here. In a sense, God can get to have his cake and eat it too here, right? On this proposal, God gets to do what we might imagine a priori to what we might expect a priori. God gets to prevent all gratuitous evil, right? Secondly, God gets to bring us to knowledge of his nature, as theists want to say is important, as Hasker in particular wants to say is terribly important. Thirdly, what do we get from this? The relevant moral motivations are not undermined, and there's no cognitive dissonance of exactly the right sort. The cognitive dissonance doesn't arise because the parts sort of don't come together in your mind. They're divinely ensured to not come together in your mind. I could be cheeky and say that maybe this is exactly what's going on, and that's why Hasker's argument hasn't received kind of greater acclaim or something like that. So there's some advantages here. But I'm sure you can imagine how Hasker would reply to this, right? I think Hasker would say that there's something profoundly morally objectionable about God meddling in our inference patterns or in our mental processes in some way. And even if it's not morally objectionable or impossible for God to do, he might say that, look, this is going to compromise some other divine goal. God couldn't intervene in our minds in this way without forfeiting some other greater good. He could tell a story like that, right? And he could, of course, sort of turn things around and say, look, some actual theists demonstrate that God is not, in fact, doing this. So there are some replies he could make. My view is that this criticism pattern here that you see here, number 4, I think that there might be various ways of cashing this out. I think these are more plausible than the previous criticisms that I suggested. I think Hasker may be vulnerable here. But let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that Hasker can defeat all of these criticisms. Okay, so let's suppose that we accept Hasker's argument. Where does that leave him? And I'll finish with that. Thought. I think if we accept Hasker's argument and say that none of these criticisms work, I think Hasker's going to be vulnerable to a different argument for atheism. That might not matter to anybody except Hasker, but I think it's a problem for Hasker's view, for Hasker's overall view. So here's the thought, right? Suppose that Hasker has indeed demonstrated the compossibility of God and gratuitous evil, right? You might be surprised to hear it, but now you've learned today that God can coexist with gratuitous evil. Indeed, he has to permit it in order to secure this greater good of having morality and so forth not be undermined. Fine. Suppose you're on board so far. I think the next natural move, and I'm not by any means the first person to say this, the next natural move is to say, why so much, right? Maybe God has good reasons to permit some gratuitous evil. Remember, the existence of the class is non-gratuitous, but the individual instances really are gratuitous. But why so much, right? So it's pretty easy to gussy up an argument to that effect, right? If God exists, it's false that gratuitous evil occurs far in excess of what God needs to occur to achieve these goals that we're assuming, for the sake of argument, God needs them to achieve. But probably gratuitous evil actually occurs far in excess of what must be permitted by God in order to achieve these goals, so probably God doesn't exist, right? Even if gratuitous evil and God are compossible, it doesn't follow that any amount of gratuitous evil is compossible with God. That's the driving idea. So what could Hasker say about this argument? Well, very briefly, it looks to me like premise 4 is pretty plausible given God's attributes, right? I mean, this doesn't come out of nowhere. The thought is that an omnipotent and omniscient and perfectly good being wouldn't do this sort of thing gratuitously, wastefully, excessively, wouldn't permit excessive amounts of gratuitous evil. Seems prima facie plausible. And of course, we're assuming that Hasker's original argument works here. So there's no, I think, sense that you can somehow rerun Hasker's argument against premise 1 against premise 4, right? I don't think this is vulnerable to Hasker's original argument. Hasker's original argument attempted to establish the compossibility of God and gratuitous evil. This argument assumes that that works and tries to show that, that there's a problem for theism with excessive gratuitous evil. So premise 4 looks to me to be pretty secure. What about premise 5? Hasker doesn't say much about this. A few critics have pointed it out, and I find it very difficult to figure out exactly what Hasker thinks about this. But I think he's saying this. I think he believes that there's something dodgy about premise 5, namely that it somehow assumes that there's a precise amount, not only a precise amount, but a precise and identifiable amount of gratuitous evil that God needs to permit in order to achieve his goals. And he thinks that that assumption is both present and illicit or objectionable in some way, right? But I'm not sure, right? I'm not sure that that's the case at all. One of Hasker's he first published on this in '92, and before that he gave a conference paper, and one of the first reply when he gave this thought experiment in a conference invoked an analogy of mashed potatoes, right? So the idea was, look, you can know that an amount of mashed potatoes that you make for a dinner of 4 is excessive, even if you don't know the exact right amount of mashed potatoes to serve at a dinner for 4. This speaks to me because I actually did this recently. I mashed an excessive amount of potatoes. So that was the move then. So even if you can't identify the optimal amount of mashed potatoes, you can still say, look, this amount X of mashed potatoes is wildly excessive for the purposes of a dinner for 4, right? And I don't think it's just about whether or not you can identify the amount. I think it's plausible to think that there's no such thing as an optimal amount of mashed potatoes for a dinner for 4. And if you believe that, you might also believe that even if there's no such thing as an optimal amount, nevertheless, you can still assert with great confidence that certain amounts of mashed potatoes are wildly excessive, even if there's no such thing as an optimal amount. So by analogy, right, I don't think that premise 5 is assuming that, or illicitly, or a fortiori, illicitly assuming that. Now, you might attack premise 5 in other ways if you're not persuaded by this argument, right? I think probably the best kind of attack for the theist to make here on premise 5 is the skeptical theist attack, right? Remember I laid out skeptical theism, the view that we should be a little bit less confident in our cognitive abilities and situation and environment and so forth. The skeptical theists are going to say, well, look, it's controversial whether any individual instance of putatively gratuitous evil really is genuinely gratuitous. Premise 5 is a much more ambitious claim. It asserts that there are many, many, many instances of genuinely gratuitous evil. That's going to be even more controversial. There are books and books and journals devoted to this question. So that might be the best way to attack premise 5. But it's not open to Hasker, right? Because Hasker's an avowed critic of skeptical theism. So to wrap up, right, I think the idea is that Hasker's argument is intriguing. His thought experiment, I think, is quite provocative. And I think there are maybe some ways that it could plausibly be attacked. But even if you concede that Hasker's argument is plausible, I think he'll be vulnerable to this successor argument. His overall position, that is, will be vulnerable. And that's it. Thank you.